Hi, I'm Kirsty Stonnell-Walker, and this is a talk I gave to the Pre-Raphaelite Sisters Conference in York in December 2019. And it's a talk about Fanny Cornforth, and not so much about her life, but about her reputation after her death and why that influences what we think of her now. The talk is called No Importance, No Meaning Apart from Rossetti, Fanny Cornforth's Struggle for Biography in the Lives of Lovers and Others. So the woman known as Fanny Cornforth lived for 74 years. She travelled from rural West Sussex to London. She travelled to Paris. She kept house for one of the most influential painter-poets of her generation. She appeared in many of his oil paintings. She kept a pub and an art gallery, raised 2 sons and buried 1, and buried 2 husbands. She ended her life in an asylum, partly because of the life choices she made due to the man she loved. She cooked that man's favourite foods, fetched painting supplies for him, sewed costumes, nursed him in ill health, and towards the end of his life attempted to wean him off chloral. After his death, she displayed her sizable art collection of 52 pieces in a gallery named after him. She sold many of those items to Samuel Bancroft Jr., with whom she had a correspondence. When she vanished, Bancroft tried to find her, but by then she'd already been placed in Graylingwell Asylum under her previous married name. She died in that asylum after a fall and is buried in an unmarked shared grave. I will start this talk with my favourite quote from Paul Franklin-Baum's book of Rossetti's letters to Fanny Cornforth, because it will give us a fair summary of what this talk is about. Fanny has, of course, no importance, no meaning apart from Rossetti. Her little bit of immortality she draws entirely from him. It is therefore his story, and it is therefore necessary to analyse her position from his point of view. This talk is therefore a journey of how we go from this image of a very jokey, fat Fanny Cornforth meeting Ruskin in a humorous cartoon that was done in the 1920s, to this image of the front cover of my book, Stunner, which is a biography of Fanny Cornforth, and how we unpick the damage done by one bold man's embarrassment, a young man's hero worship, and the need to make sense of a very human narrative. This talk is in 3 parts. To start with, we will look at Fanny's place in biography, then her role as a fictional character, and finally what I like to call Fanny on film, the depictions of Fanny Cornforth on stage and screen. By the end of it, I hope we can find importance and meaning and immortality, and what it means to be a woman in a male narrative. It must be odd to appear in a biography within your own lifetime, much like having a review. And I've had some corkers in my time, including one saying my writing might be lacklustre, but my eyebrow game is strong. I also received a stinker on Amazon for A Curl of Copper and Pearl from someone who felt that I'd stolen their boyfriend. Lorks. All this is small fry in comparison to how, in 1882, Fanny suddenly found herself in print for the first time. Rossetti had, of course, died in the April, and then with indecent haste, books on his life appeared, at least 2 within the same year. It seems unlikely that Thomas Hall Caine would be beaten to the punch, but I'm in no hurry to get to him, so instead we'll start with William Sharp. Sharp's biography, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, A Record and Study, was published within months of Rossetti's death. Sharp does not sully the record of this genius by mentioning women, so Fanny does not get a look in, and at the back of the book Sharp has a catalogue of Rossetti's work, which completely misses out all the items owned by Fanny, which would be exhibited at the Rossetti Gallery the following year. Sharp takes the cautious path of describing the model without having to talk about the woman. Therefore, Fanny does not get a mention, but the figure of the blue bower is a beautiful woman clad in a robe of superb sea green, bordered and lined with soft white fur, this latter falling in thick folds over her bosom, but leaving the full throat bare in its own beauty. He then goes on to say that the woman has nothing of conventional loveliness. She is beautiful, with the irresistible fascination of supreme bodily loveliness. And add to all this, she knows music and therefore shares the siren's charm. Sharp is effusive in his praise of the image and yet omits the woman. If only all biography was that even-handed. But here we are, swiftly at the trap in 1882, the biography of Rossetti, written by his companion in his final hours, whether Rossetti had liked it or not, Thomas Hall Caine, later a playwright and a novelist from the Isle of Man. And in 1881, he was a young man in search of a hero. The year he spent with Rossetti until the painter's death was then hastily written up as first Recollections of Rossetti, published by the end of 1882, and then later as the more operatic My Story in 1908. The latter is by far the more dramatic work, although it covers the same ground as the earlier book and draws questions about why Hall Caine felt the need to retrace the ground. Possibly the answer lies in what is added to the 1908 text, and that is the figure of the villainous nurse who accompanies Rossetti and the loyal Hall Caine to Cumbria in the autumn of 1881. That nurse was, of course, Fanny. My Story, taken on its own, is a tale of a pseudo-father and son, a relationship Caine explicitly states in the text, and Fanny is cut out. In a letter to Theodore Watts Dunton, Rossetti recounts an expedition up the Great Howe, where Rossetti slid down on his backside, his broader basis, as Fanny laughed. Hall Caine was so amused by Fanny's laughter, he could not help but laugh himself. In telling the same story with the same language, Hall Caine turns it into a bonding moment between men, without a woman in sight. While contemporaries would have known, Fanny is changed into the archetypal uncaring nurse from whom Rossetti has to be saved. In his weakened peril, Rossetti becomes the equivalent of a damsel in distress, tied to the railway tracks by the wicked uncle, or in our case, Nurse Fanny. Hall Caine casts himself as the hero, there to save the day. The train in this analogy is Rossetti's lifestyle, or more exactly, chloral. This is a prime example of a negative source that is given far more weight by others than it possibly deserves. Hall Caine's omission of Fanny sets a precedent in certain biographies that follow. The rule of thumb becomes, if the author thanks Hall Caine, then you know what, or more pertinently, whose story is to be told, or rather not told. Therefore, in Esther Wood's 1894 Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the Pre-Raphaelite Movement, Fanny is not mentioned by name, despite discussing the oils in which she appears and even having a section on the models that feature in his artwork, including Alexa Wilding. Another rule of thumb I have is that if the author mentions Alexa but not Fanny, something is amiss. Exhibit A in this case has to be Frederick Stephen's biography of his friend. To start with, he lists Alexa in the index but not Fanny, and then goes on to discuss the paintings in which Fanny appears in, correctly stating that the same person modelled for Bocca Baciata, the Blue Bower and the original Lady Lilith, but then lets us side down by identifying that model as Ruth Herbert. You have to wait until the influence of Samuel Bancroft Jr. at the turn of the century and a new generation of American biographers to add a more personality and relationship feel to the narrative. In, for example, Elizabeth Luther Carey's The Rossettis of 1900, Carey calls Fanny the model who possibly did the most to counteract the effect upon Rossetti's painting of the gloomy, Proserpine type of beauty, and states that Rossetti is never so much a painter as when he is painting Fanny Cornforth. It is no wonder that Fanny herself announced that the book was exceedingly good in a letter to Bancroft in 1901. It would be tempting to say that Carey, the first full-time art critic for the New York Times, has gender as her difference in approach, but I don't think any of us are naive enough to believe that that really would have made a difference. So maybe the separation of an ocean enabled Carey to detach herself from the same negative narrative or basic omissions. Saying that, the very British, well, colonially British, Henry Curry Marillier manages to dodge the negatives and uses William Michael Rossetti's description of Fanny as a preeminently fine woman in his 1899 biography of Rossetti. Marillier manages to combine the testimony of others with steady knowledge of who the players are in the story, not making the mistake that earlier biographies make in not knowing Fanny by the name Mrs. Hughes and Mrs. Shott. His careful use of William Michael Rossetti's recently published account of his brother's life is interesting for what it includes as for what it omits. Within this first generation of biographies, William Michael Rossetti's Rossetti Papers of 1903 manages to cleanse Fanny from the family business, but in his 1895 biography of his brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, His Family Letters with a Memoir, we get a contrary, paradoxical, and extremely influential keynote for Fanny Cornforth and how she is treated in subsequent biographies. When talking about the sitter for Bocca Baciata, William Michael uses the now infamous story told by William Bell Scott about cracking nuts between teeth. It is to William Michael's credit, which I say through gritted teeth, that despite loathing Fanny personally, as displayed in his actions after Rossetti's death, he caveats Bell Scott's story slightly by saying, "I cannot recollect ever hearing anything about the nuts," but then goes on to say, "but do not contest Mr. Scott's statement on that point," thus fixing in stone the origin story for Fanny, repeated constantly all the way up to Desperate Romantics and Henrietta Garner's 2012 Wives and Stunners. It was the first time in a while that I'd actually read the Bell Scott story as a primary source, and it is a masterclass in understatement and subtext. Fanny is presented as a woman on the Strand cracking nuts between her teeth. From that, subsequent biographers drew prostitution and an animalistic basic nature that also led to accusations of illiteracy, theft, and lies. But within her lifetime of first flush of biography, Fanny was spared those character portraits. She'd have to wait for a new breed of biography, the historical fiction variety, which found its birth in Violet Hunt's The Wife of Rossetti of 1932. When the biography of a painter and poet has her alleged suicide note on its title page, you know you're in for a bumpy ride. Possibly the zenith of pre-Raphaelite fiction, the account of Fanny is so extreme and bizarre that it could not possibly be believed when you read the accounts that had preceded it. However, in the dialogue recounted in Hunt's work, and I always feel dialogue in a biography tells you exactly how seriously you should take it, it does not sound different from the performances of Fanny Cornforth we shall discuss in the final part of this talk. As I move into a discussion of Fanny Cornforth in fiction, I think there's no stronger place to start than this alleged work of non-fiction, because it sets a standard for what is now an established genre of historical fiction with biographical notes. However, Violet Hunt surpasses even the most imaginative novels with her flight of extraordinary fancy when it comes to Fanny, the foil for her piece. I'd like to just pause on this slide because I think we all have to appreciate quite how astonished and horrified the cat looks. He looks like all of us when we have read, frankly, anything written by Violet Hunt. Anyway, to understand where the roots of The Wife of Rossetti lie, you have to understand the sources that Hunt used. Violet Hunt's mother, Margaret Raine, studied art under William Bell Scott at Newcastle, and the families remained close. It is from stories heard from her mother's tutor that Hunt grew to detest Rossetti, viewing him as half man, half devil. In Barbara Belford's biography of Hunt, much is made of the fact of Hunt's own problematic affair with pre-Raphaelite grandchild Ford Madox Ford, and how her perceived ill treatment by one pre-Raphaelite man made her over-identified with the possible ill treatment of Elizabeth Siddal by the nefarious Rossetti. As for Fanny, Hunt's foray into her biographical details is quite extraordinary. She was, and I quote, "from a family originating in the mythological union of one of Odin's ravens with a Saxon maiden." No, really. Descended from Jacobites, she had a great uncle who could never eat butcher's meat because it reminded him of the smell of roasting rebels in the marketplace. Fanny's ancestors were of romantic stock, all Jacobites and Catholics, but slow elements of deceit are introduced and included of how she, or possibly an ancestor, as Hunt tends to blend one with the other, was either too lazy or too stupid to do her schoolwork, but bribed other children to do it for her by promising apricots and peaches from her garden, which actually only contained apples and plums. Despite an extended entry via her northern ancestry, by the time she reappears in Hunt's text, she is a good Cockney soul who throws nutshells at him and hurls herself bodily upon Rossetti if he loiters. According to Hunt, Rossetti had loved it. For once, the careless frankness of the troll who can refuse a man nothing, but has no particular interest in giving it, just fond of a guinea and not averse of delivering the goods. Bouncing, comfortable, high-spirited and high-bosomed, Fanny is generally good-humoured, but not respectable, and an easy fit for Rosabelle in the painting Found. As Elizabeth grows paler and thinner and more remote from the blustering, clumsy Rossetti, Fanny grows easier and more expansive. As Hunt says, if Elizabeth's monogram was a dove, Fanny's might well have been a wombat. Hunt acknowledges the animosity between her source and her subject, set within the framework of Rossetti's infidelity to Lizzie. Naturally, Scott hated Fanny, as he hated all of Gabriel's intimates, Hunt wrote, linking it to the moment at a dinner party where Fanny drew loud attention to Scott's alopecia. The quote, well known now, about Mr. Scott's high brows and high lashes is followed by this: "They laughed at her and she pouted beautifully. That was the worst or the best of the witch." The incident is lifted from William Allingham's diary of Sunday the 26th of June 1864 with a small adjustment. It is only Rossetti who laughs in Allingham's account, as he says, immoderately, and there are no other guests other than the two men and Fanny. By Hunt's account, Fanny announces as loudly as Scott leaves a full dinner party as the doors close behind him, to the amusement of all the other partygoers. If Hunt's variation came from Scott, then it could be argued that Scott knew of the contents of Allingham's diary before its publication in 1907, and possibly this is the reason for the story of the nuts and the Strand coming into being. For Hunt, Fanny is Lizzie's golden tormentor, unable to stop her constant act of cruelty by the very act of kindness to Rossetti. She cooks his favourite meals with onions. She is chatty or silent depending on his needs. She is uncomplicated. Hunt supposes that she really felt or simulated the tenderness in which poor Lizzie was entirely lacking, or simulated being a very interesting proviso. It is to Fanny that Rossetti goes on the night of Lizzie's death. It is Fanny who appears the next day for her sitting because, as Hunt puts it, there was now no one to forbid or mind. Fanny helps herself to the paintings, and Rossetti is too miserable to miss them. William Michael, after Rossetti's death, according to Hunt, could never find the paintings that Fanny appeared in, a hint that Hunt's sources had all gone to Fanny's art show at the Rossetti galleries to see what works of art she had acquired. In signing off from the tragedy of Elizabeth Siddal's undoubted suicide, Hunt gives us a postscript of Rossetti's fractured life, into the cracks of which Fanny wiggles complacently. Although Hunt wavers within the narrative to assigning the role of villainess to Fanny, her description at the end leaves you in no doubt. Rossetti takes Fanny back to her native Newcastle, where he sells the small oil head of hers to George Ray, described thus: "Mr. Ray bought a little picture of Mrs. Hughes, looking tragic as harpies can, her blunt features somewhat sharpened, perhaps by the terrible happenings in which she had been art and part." The novels that would follow Violet Hunt's biography of Elizabeth Siddal all owe a great debt of gratitude, as she opened the lid on social biography through the dramatic reconstruction which the Pre-Raphaelites have lived through ever since. Hot on Hunt's heels came Frances Winworth's equally blurred line work, as she says in her opening note to the 1933's Poor Splendid Wings. This is not fictionalized history or biography, though it reads like a novel. For the first time, Rossetti's two great loves are drawn from the pious mists of innuendos and brought to the light in an attempt to interpret its otherwise irreconcilable actions. On paper, Winworth was the perfect biographer of Rossetti, herself a translator of the Decameron, and author of a novel, The Ardent Flame, on Paolo and Francesca. It is, however, despite occasional flourishes, a biography, complete with bibliography. As Winworth had consulted both Hall Caine's biographies in her reading, the portrait of Fanny is unsurprising. Winworth shares Hunt's obsession for contrasting the robust Fanny with the frail Lizzie, not to mention her other skills, and I quote, "Her hands were soft and plump, and she could grasp a man's hands strongly, and she was generous." The description is followed immediately with the nut story, the inference being that it's not just Rossetti's hands she was being generous with. It takes until 1954 and Nerina Schute's Victorian love story for the genre to take hold and a different take on Fanny to emerge, free from the bias and strictures of biography, however loosely it is applied. Possibly the distance in time, even more so than Hunt, allows freedom to insert humour into the otherwise tragic and blame-laden narrative, and Fanny is a gift for light relief, despite her strong hands. She is no longer a nut-spitting prostitute, but a woman who plays hide-and-seek, then makes love outrageously in the shadows, watched by other pairs of lovers. Rossetti becomes a comedy Casanova, forever sidestepping the smart but unlucky Miss Siddle, to quote one of their arguments. "Where did you spend the night?" demanded Miss Sid. "And who with? Was it Annie Miller?" "Of course not. How can you imagine such a thing?" "Because Emma saw you at Craymore Gardens." "Emma is a stupid, uneducated girl with a dangerous tongue," said Rossetti in anger. "She could not possibly have seen me with Annie Miller." "Why not?" shrilled Miss Sid. "Because," said Rossetti with dignity, "I passed the night with Fanny Hughes." Rossetti attempted to comfort her. "You must know, my dear Guggums, that you are the woman I love. Did I not beg you to return?" "That only makes it worse," wept Miss Sid. "I never thought you would do such a wicked thing behind my back." "But," said Rossetti, appealing to reason, "I could not do it before your face." Again, Fanny is the cause of Lizzie's jealousy and heartache, but equally Fanny's feelings are taken into consideration. For Shute, the plight of Fanny, honest and uneducated, is to be pitied just as much as Lizzie, and there is a balance between them shown in a comic scene where Fanny poses in one room and Lizzie in her invalid bed in the other, using a bell to summon her erstwhile husband away from Fanny. Lizzie's static emotional state is contrasted with Fanny's movement and ability to offer Rossetti all sorts of bodily temptations, including rabbit stew with onions. Rossetti's reasoning for his inability to choose between is expressed in this exchange. "If only my dear Lizzie could be vulgar like you." "I ain't vulgar," said Fanny indignantly. "If you could be soulful," said Rossetti, "or Lizzie could be vulgar, I should be the happiest man in the world." "I ain't vulgar," said Fanny again. "I am natural, that's all. When I love a man, I like a bit of love." "Well, so do I," said Lizzie's husband. In fact, it's hard to see what Fanny gets out of the relationship, especially after Lizzie's death. Fanny moves into Tudor house, framed in the imagery of Catherine Parr and Henry VIII, the last companionable love of a king. All is not well with Rossetti, however, forever haunted by Lizzie, even though Fanny eloquently points out, "It ain't your fault if your wife went and done herself in." Fanny's love for Rossetti is repeated often in their conversations, and Rossetti's gratitude for it is acknowledged. However, things do not seem to go the other way. As Shute writes, "I ain't going to leave you, not never," says Fanny. "Well, thank God for that. I don't know what I should do," said Rossetti, "without you." "Neither do I," said Fanny. "What with all them animals on top of everything else. It's a wonder I'm alive to tell the tale," she said reproachfully, and then added, "Do you love me, Rossetti?" "No," said Rossetti. "I've never loved anyone but Lizzie." "Oh dear," said Fanny, "it doesn't seem fair." "But I need you," said Rossetti. "Indeed, I cannot bear you out of my sight. You see, Fan, I must not be left alone, not even for half an hour." Fanny's faithfulness in the face of Rossetti's many, many peculiarities is remarkable, and he really does become even more peculiar as time and the book wears on. However, as the good and loyal Fanny says towards the end of the story, "I will look after you, even if you go off your head." But in the end she is kept from his deathbed by his respectable family, as she believes a punishment from God, as the final line of the book says, "Poor Rossetti had been so wicked." So far so traditional, and still all variations of the same themes. Fanny is a buxom country lass who drops Sir H's and picks up things that don't belong to her. Fanny is the antithesis of Lizzie, and all Lizzie wants to achieve, well, in the notions of the novelists. Even as late as Rita Cameron's 2015 Ophelia's Muse, Fanny is still the comfy bed Rossetti can lounge on, while Lizzie struggles to make their life work together. By attempting to extend the lot of her Victorian womanhood by writing and painting, Lizzie has no time to constantly indulge her man-child husband. Fanny is all the indulgence, just there to be used up by her lover until he doesn't fancy her any more. Then the poor elephant is cast aside. There are arguably a hint of judgment in Fanny's face, but for reasons that have been morphed over time. To start with, it could be surmised that a woman who lived with a man who wasn't her husband was aware that she occupied a precarious state, and that any consequences of this were their own fault. Fanny's role as mistress was taken on the understanding that she had no legal or moral place in Rossetti's life, therefore her ejection from his life is taken as the result. It would be unnatural for her to have benefit from that life choice. Later, however, different nuances are given to her fate. She is so often the contrast to Lizzie. Fanny is uneducated, Lizzie is improving herself. Lizzie tries to get Rossetti to change, to improve their relationship. Fanny constantly bows to his demands in order to keep him. By the latter half of the 20th century, the dynamic of judgment finds Fanny's free love attractiveness, but her constant availability for Rossetti's spoilt child unsatisfactory, whereas Lizzie's refusal of Rossetti's petulance in the face of her own self-improvement is greeted as a feminist virtue. In my opinion, the closest to perfection in a Pre-Raphaelite novel is Elizabeth Savage's 1978 Willowwood. Split into 3 sections, Lizzie, Janie and Fanny, it charts Rossetti's life through the 3 women who loved him. The novel, despite starting with a section entitled Lizzie, starts like this. Her name was not really Fanny Cornforth. Her name was really Sarah Cox, but since she had a habit of appropriating that which she preferred, she took the name, and had a right to it in a way, because Cornforth was the name of a great aunt before her. This aunt had been an actress, and although actresses are not highly regarded, Fanny had thought to be one because noblemen wanted to set you up in luxury. But that was when she was 12. Now she is 16, she knows that she is too lazy for it. For the stage, that is. Whilst Fanny is presented in a way that reads straight out of Violet Hunt, walnut shells and all, there is not the same level of dismissiveness and judgment that previous works contain. However, still we see Fanny through Rossetti and his needs. For example, and I quote, Rossetti is quite serious. The women who he paints are spirituelle. A breath would carry them away. They have no legs. But he likes Fanny because she has no side, and spills her friendliness as easy as Flora scatters flowers. Fanny has no side, obviously referring to her rounded shape, but also that nothing is hidden, nothing is internalized. Fanny has no hidden depth that Rossetti is aware of, and so she's easy company. Savage does not imply this is because Fanny is stupid, quite the opposite, and refers to Fanny as a big ripe girl and clever, with nothing of Lizzie's exhausting self-concern, but also that Fanny is shrewd enough to know that Rossetti needs a woman with no side, a woman who laughs at anxiety and endless inner life. Savage uses dialogue between them to show the difference in the relationships. Rossetti wants Fanny to clean the house because he has guests coming home. Fanny suggests that if he made up his quarrel with Lizzie, then maybe she'd do the washing up. Rossetti finds the idea ridiculous and tells her so, adding that Fanny is getting fat. In comparison with the ever-escalating arguments between Rossetti and Lizzie in the book, this one between him and Fanny is diffused quickly by Fanny's laughter at his insult. "Ah, well," said Fanny comfortably, "you know I love to eat. And anyway, Hughes likes a proper armful." Gabriel grinned. "He has good taste," he says. The couple go from arguing to laughing affectionately in seconds. As in previous accounts of the relationship, Savage seems to imply that Fanny senses what Rossetti needs and complies, but it does her no good, as she will never command his attention like Lizzie does, as Lizzie is what he wants in terms of artistic ambition and image. What Lizzie will not or cannot achieve is peaceful existence with Rossetti. Neither of them compromise and drive each other mad, but Rossetti has Fanny to enable his bad behaviour because he knows he always has her to run to. The night of Lizzie's death is a prime example of this. It is a scene, like the Stations of the Cross, ingrained in Pre-Raphaelite law, in which Fanny is an off-stage player. The exchange between Lizzie and Rossetti was not witnessed, and so what we have now is a piece of supposition which has somehow become fact. As Rossetti leaves for the Working Men's College, Lizzie shouts, "It is not your night, you are going to that slut." "At least," Rossetti replies, "Fanny is pleasant company." Rossetti's part in Lizzie's death is fluid as to the level of blame ascribed. In Savage's book, he hands her the laudanum in the midst of their vicious fight and tells her to take the lot. Fanny's level of blame is complex, as seemingly her name, conjured in a fight, is enough to push Lizzie over the edge. Fanny is the problem in their marriage. Fanny is the thing making Lizzie ill, the thing that Lizzie wishes for no more of. Fanny is the laudanum, the anger, the discontent. The relationship is not between Rossetti and his women, but between the women themselves, as Savage notes about Lizzie in the closing of the book. So one might say that in a way she won, as in a way one might say Fanny lost. Although she does claim the last line of Savage's book, as with Nerina Shute, again it's only through the tragedy that Rossetti's death brings to her and her life with him. As if to emphasise the uncertainty of Fanny's place in the narrative of Rossetti, William Michael refuses her a place at the coffin's side. As Savage says in closing, but Gabriel would have let the old elephant come. However, by 1882, Rossetti had done absolutely nothing to ensure Fanny's safety after his death. I would argue he enabled far worse treatment of her than anything others imagine he perpetrated against Elizabeth Siddal. For a Victorian and then early 20th century audiences, Fanny is a difficult character to fit neatly into the narrative. She gives, but she takes. She's low and he likes it. She's rough, but a comfort. Possibly we'd have to wait until the later 20th century and technology undreamed of in Rossetti's lifetime to make sense of Fanny's importance. As a precursor to Fanny on film, there are few instances of Fanny on stage. Before the advent of desperate romantics, plays depicting the life and loves of Rossetti had varying success. Starting with The Merciless Lady of 1934, it was judged that the story of Pre-Raphaelite romances would be unlikely to attract other than those with literary and artistic tastes. It did in fact attract various members of the Rossetti family who were noted in reviews to have been amongst the audience and gave their approval to the performance. Fanny Cornforth, as portrayed by Elspeth March, was praised as a brazen, cheerful little cockney. The play traced the relationship between a cold, proud, virtuous model and pupil with the painter-poet, wrecked by his infatuation with that other red-headed model, Fanny Cornforth, ill-educated and coarse to a degree. The play has it that it was Fanny's insistence that drew Rossetti away from his wife on the night she died, very much in the vein of Violet Hunt's assertion, leading one to assume there was little mystery over the identity of the merciless lady. Barely a year later, a play originally entitled Women Loved Him, but retitled simply Rossetti, ran into trouble with the Rossetti family. The public representation of the play had to be abandoned after a complaint by one of William Michael's descendants. But as quoted in The Stage on the 6th of June 1935, this was not much of a loss. The real discerning admirers and lovers of Rossetti, as painter and poet, are not at all interested in any of his possible weaknesses as a fallible human being, or as a morbidly sensitive man of genius, and that the last thing they would ever dream of would be to indulge in the vulgar habit of listening at or spying through keyholes. Least of all are they concerned as to the precise nature of Rossetti's real or fictional relationships with his models, some of whom were presumably of easy virtue and picked up from the streets. Blimey, I'll get my coat then. If you were keen on seeing the unedifying sight of Rossetti drugged with neat whisky and chloral in the arms of the vulgar Fanny Cornforth, you had to wait until 1949, when the play was revived, with Ellen Pollock as the engaging slattern, Fanny Cornforth, who provided much needed lightness to the otherwise gloomy vignettes of the artist's life. After that, there was only a briefly held play We Dig for the Stars by T.B. Morris in 1955, concerning Rossetti's life after the death of Elizabeth Siddal, which, according to the Catholic Standards Review, lacked any actual dramatic point, only lots of drama. One of the few redeeming features was the performance of former singer and Irish treasure Kathleen Delaney as Fanny, providing sufficient mordant humour to save the play from sheer melodrama. As in the later biographies, Fanny's comic relief provided the light, the shade of Rossetti's more worthy relationship with his wife and then Jane Morris. Even though it was possible to have a Rossetti story without the physical presence of Elizabeth Siddal, as witnessed in the unusual We Dig for the Stars, Rossetti without the vulgar presence of Fanny seemed to be a theatrical impossibility for reasons that will become apparent as we change media. So then to the screen, starting with Ken Russell's infamous 1967 extravaganza Dante's Inferno. The most experimental and raucous incarnation of the story has the well-worn narrative at its heart, but weaves mysterious nods to modern sensibilities in its staging. Ken Russell was open about his inspiration for his Rossetti piece, and that came in the form of Rossetti's relationship with Fanny. In his autobiography, A British Picture, Russell describes how he wanted to reconstruct a duel with gin bottles he imagined Rossetti and Fanny having atop the Golden Howe in the Lake District. Sadly, that particular image does not make it into the final film, although there's enough rushing around in the countryside to please anyone. Whether or not the glorious Pat Ashton, in her first television role as Fanny, was the actress Russell describes as being high during most of the filming, owing to the bottle of LSD she took with her tea, remains a mystery. She is certainly the one who's having all the fun. In comparison to the extremely cockney Elizabeth Siddal and the weird and incestuous Christina Rossetti, Fanny, a model of rather wider experience, has enormous fun asking William Michael Rossetti at one point, "What's the matter? Haven't you ever seen anyone laughing before?" Fanny is again played for laughs in a very modern way, to the point where her accompanying music is a Victorian barrel organ version of There's No Business Like Show Business. She is written out of Rossetti's life when the serious business is going on, only to reappear when the artist becomes pathetic and needy. In a marked contrast to Elizabeth Siddal's obsession with Rossetti's other lovers, Fanny shows more anger over the difficult Rossetti than Jane Morris, played here by Gala Mitchell. Interestingly, as the film slows its wild pace, Fanny's relationship with Rossetti begins to reflect Rossetti's relationship with Elizabeth, but now it is Fanny who is trapped in love with a self-involved addict. The final scenes show Rossetti scaling the mountain with Fanny, but instead of the laughter reported in Rossetti's letter, Russell shows the artist becoming lost and dying, a drunk and drug-addled mess. Dante's Inferno signified Russell and Oliver Reed's third project together, and although Reed is arguably one of the most charismatic Rossettis on film, the couple's shorthand in direction with commands such as Moody 1 or Moody 2, referring to the intensity of smouldering meanness required, means that Rossetti becomes a one-note performance of handsome brooding. Against this, Pat Ashton's cheeky good time girl come carer has more nuance and journey, leading me to believe that she was not the imbiber of the high tea. In comparison, the BBC's second foray into Rossettiana, The Love School, is a far more sober affair. Available recently for the first time on DVD, it is a treat for those of us born in the 70s and later, but it surprises the viewer by being a piece about the Pre-Raphaelites that isn't shockingly Rossetti-centric. In fact, you have to get over halfway through the series before the relationship between Rossetti and Elizabeth is explored, and it's only after Elizabeth's death that Fanny appears, with no histrionics and no accusations. She is possibly the most proper and dependable incarnation of Miss Cornforth, active in her role as nurse and buttoned up like a disgruntled duchess. Ben Kingsley's Rossetti only gives us brief glimpses of something more intimate between the couple as he refers to the lovely lumpses and her smashing bum. Again, Fanny is seen interacting with other women of the circle, but unlike Dante's Inferno, April Wilding's Fanny has an edge to her which could be interpreted either as jealousy or concern at her lover's mental state. Her intrusion into the series of photographs of Jane Morris, taken in the garden of Cheyne Walk when she was resident, is coloured by ownership and wariness. What we get in The Love School is a proper grown-up Fanny, capable of more than just jolly Nancy from Oliver Twist, incapable of keeping her clothes on or behaving properly in company. Fanny is shown with William Michael Rossetti discussing in tense tones the nature of Rossetti's care. In this way, it's easier to understand William Michael and Fanny as a divorcing parents battling over who loves their damaged child more. If only the Beeb had left it at that, but no. Once more into the Pre-Raphaelite land we ventured in 2009 for Desperate Romantics. Had I seen The Love School, I believe my hopes might have been even higher than they were, as Love School managed to bring Fanny into the narrative without the gift of a mouthful of nutshells. However, that was not to be, and in episode 5 of 6, a shabbily dressed baggage appeared from the darkness and spat nuts at a man she fancied. Intrigued, Rossetti asked, "Do you make a habit of spitting?" To which the answer is, of course, "Depends what I have in my mouth at the time, sir." We are definitely in the realms of Dante's Inferno with this depiction of Fanny, there for the nudity and general sauciness, in case the thrust of the story, if you excuse the phrase, is all a bit heavy. It seems that by 2009 we expect our Rossetti to be a handsome lech, and the problem with Lizzie Siddle was that she was just too classy and clothed. Fanny is there to provide a bit of colour, laughter, and to eat chicken legs naked, just so that we can watch Aidan Turner do likewise. An utterly preposterous wedding reception scene is the only moment where our girl reveals over a pipe that her character might actually possess depth, albeit with a magnificent bosom in case anyone gets bored. I have heard desperate romantics claimed as saving the Pre-Raphaelites from obscurity, and I find this possibly true but deeply problematic, especially in the case of people like Fanny. It feels like a backward step in our understanding of her, especially considering that by the time of the writing and making of the series, my biography of her, Stunner, had been out for a number of years and was read by the actress playing Fanny, who felt in need of some context and character because Lord knows she wasn't given any in the script. I think that it's telling that I got to view The Love School almost a decade after I saw Desperate Romantics, and in many ways it handled the source material in a far more mature manner, in tune with our current thinking about the lives of Pre-Raphaelite women. That Fanny should evolve from a 1960s free spirit into a weary carer within the confines of Dante's Inferno, but really only make the transition from kept woman to discarded woman in Desperate Romantics is troubling. However, one thing Desperate Romantics can be forgiven is that Fanny gets some truly hilarious lines, including, "Just because I work with me below decks doesn't mean I don't have an art. I will forever regret that I called my biography Stunner, when it really should have been called My Below Decks, the Fanny Cornforth Story." So my conclusion is this. The woman known as Fanny Cornforth was actually a woman called Sarah Cox. She lived for 74 years. She travelled from rural West Sussex to London, doing all the malarkey I listed at the beginning, ending her days in an asylum, partly because she was also Fanny Cornforth. When Baum says Fanny has no importance, no meaning apart from Rossetti, he's right. Fanny is entirely a construct built by ourselves and Rossetti and Miss Sarah Cox of Stenning. Fanny Cornforth was made in the diary of George Price Boyce, the fragile, petulant spite of William Bell Scott, and the changeable favour of William Michael Rossetti. The problem is, of course, where does Sarah end and Fanny begin? I place emphasis in this talk on Violet Hunt, as she marks a very decided turning point in our understanding of Fanny. Before Violet, Fanny is either ignored for whatever reason, slightly mentioned, or vaguely praised. After Hunt, Fanny becomes a fixed point, a main player. In the TV show of the Pre-Raphaelites, or more specifically, the Rossettis, Fanny gets her name in the opening credits. That's because Rossetti's story becomes poor Lizzie's story, and Fanny has a part to play in helping shape our understanding of Miss Siddle. In each retelling of Rossetti's life, or occasionally Elizabeth Siddle's story, Fanny rarely varies in character. She's a Cockney, without acknowledgement that for the Victorians, Cockney often just referred to somebody working class. Fanny is easy virtue with broad hints towards actual prostitution, and as fat as Lizzie is thin. Fanny is temptation, the test that Rossetti fails, the punishment for his failure. All this, of course, has nothing to do with Sarah Cox, Sarah Hughes, or Sarah Schott, a woman whose life consisted of more than just Mr. and Mrs. Rossetti and their marital and chemical difficulties. We should treat Fanny as more than just a stick to beat Rossetti with. Her worth is more than just to prove Rossetti was dissolute. Fanny is the personification of his low pleasure. Without any talent, she can't read, tell the truth, speak proper. What is she for? What is he choosing in choosing Fanny above Elizabeth? He is making the choice between body and soul. He chooses Fanny, the body, and what happens? She gets fat and loses her looks, and he is stuck with her. A neatly wrapped morality tale to teach us all a lesson. All this is lazy biography. Women like Fanny have no agency, no voice of their own. They're at the mercy of agency of others who have no investment in telling their story. For Fanny, She is equally at the mercy of the kindly narrative of men like William Allingham and George Price Boyce, as she is at the harsh negative of Hall Caine. We have to remember that the account of these men can just be opinion, to be doubted just as much as second-hand knowledge. It is fair to scrutinise the correlation between William Bell Scott's nut story and the dinner party reported in Allingham's diary. When writing biography, we should be aware of everyone in the life of our subject, as we are writing their biography as a byproduct. No one is devoid of meaning outside the life of another. No life is merely there to service our understanding of a greater, more deserving subject. However, as I said, Baum is correct, as Fanny is not the person, she is the character who existed for the artists who had a part in her creation. We do a great disservice to Sarah Cox of Stenning by mistaking her for the role she played, and her importance, her meaning, has an impact for all of us. Even if you are not as Fanny-centric as I am, and heaven knows I have spent a quarter of a century proving that Fanny has importance and meaning beyond a mouthful of nutshells, then it's not hard to appreciate that the way we treat lesser roles in biographies, novels and films reflects how we treat people we regard as less deserving of our intentions. Fanny's meaning and importance is she teaches us that no one deserves to be a punchline, a reward, a punishment in someone else's life. And until we learn to treat women in the past with decency, we will continue to extend that discourtesy to women now. No woman is proof of a man's decency or depravity. And in fact, no man or woman should draw their meaning or importance through a third party at that person's expense, even if in some cases, Wallace Simpson, their subsequent actions leave you in very little doubt. We're not a hierarchy of meanings and importance, with the working class and women at the bottom rung. If I leave you with one message, and it is one from my heart, it is this. In biography, every single Fanny matters. Has meaning, has importance, no matter how inconsequential, because in the record of this moment, who do you imagine you are? If you are not careful, someone else might decide for you, and we all know how that ends. Thank you very much.